I hope you had a good break, extended break. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm super excited to hear what Dr. Feher has to share in her presentation. A bit of background of Dr. Feher. She is a biologist and data scientist with the National Park Service, specifically with the Northeast Coastal and Barrier Inventory and Monitoring Program. She has an MS in biology from University of Louisiana and a BS in, MS in biology. I'm not sure I said that correctly, from University of Louisiana and a BS in biology from Salisbury University and a BS in marine biology from University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Many of you know Dr. Feher from reading her publications and also during her time when she worked at USGS in the Wetlands and Aquatic Research Center in Louisiana. Her research interests include SETs, yay, thank you, the effects of climate change, extreme events on salt, marsh and mangrove ecosystems, wetland restoration, data visualization, and data analysis. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Feher. Thank you for agreeing to give a talk, and you can take it from there.
All right. Thank you, Nisa. And I need to preface that I am hashtag not a doctor, but I appreciate elevating me to that role. It's very nice. Let me see if we can get this going correctly. Can you guys see that? Okay? It's in the right view and everything?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about evolution of the SET data lifecycle and some strategies for integrating research into natural resource management. So my name is Laura Feher. I am the biologist / data scientist for the Northeast Coastal and Barrier Inventory and Monitoring Network. I'm with the National Park Service. We have sites all along the northeast coast of the U.S., but right now I am located at Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. And we're in Cambridge, Maryland. We're located on the same property as Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, which I'm guessing a lot of you might be familiar with. So I'm going to go first over an outline of the things that I'm going to talk about because I'm going to bounce around with a couple different topics here. They're all interrelated though. So I'll first just quickly talk about my background and my current research focus. Then I'll get into what I call the SET data lifecycle. And I'll talk about that in the context of research versus and monitoring. Some common SET data issues that I've seen, ways that we can fortify the SET lifecycle, tools for fortifying the SET lifecycle, some strategies and examples for integrating SET research into natural resource management, and then some tools for integrating research into natural resource management. So my background, I have a BS in biology from Salisbury University, and then another BS in environmental and marine science from University of Maryland Eastern Shore. I got my master's degree in biology from UL Lafayette. From 2015 to 2024, I was an ecologist at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center down in Lafayette, Louisiana. And that was where I started my SET career. But since about spring of last year, I've been with the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Division, the Northeast Coastal and Barrier Network. And my research interests and expertise include anything related to coastal ecology, salt marshes and mangroves, environmental data science, data synthesis, the effects of climate change on coastal ecosystems, and wetland restoration. So I thought it was important that I lay out what my SET experience is so that you don't think I'm just some random person coming in here and telling you what to do with your sets. I've worked on a number of different SET projects. So the first one was the series of USGS sets that they have in Everglades National Park. And these were sets that were originally set up by Tom Smith in the 90s. And that effort's now being led by Mike Oslin, who is at USGS in Lafayette. And so these sets are some of the oldest in the world. But a lot of the data that was collected from this project never got published. So a big part of my job there was organizing and QA/QCing data from over 20 years of set measurements. And that led to these 3 different papers that I have linked here. Another project that I worked on was fish and wildlife sets in the coastal refuges along the Texas coast with Gina Moon. And for that project, I organized, QA/QC'd, and analyzed Gina's set data from those 9 different refuges. Then more recently, I did a synthesis paper of all of the SET data from South Florida. So there had been a number of different people collecting SET data from that South Florida region, Everglades, 10,000 Islands, Rookery Bay, Biscayne National Park. And so I was tasked with, number one, integrating all of that data. So that was data from 14 different partners. It included 122 set stations across 51 different sites. And for that project, I developed some custom R scripts for the transformation and analysis and published 2 different papers that recently came out in the special issue of Estuaries and Coast. Now, currently, since I've been with the Park Service, I've taken over reading all of, I'm sure everybody knows Jim Lynch. He retired earlier this year, and myself and another person in our network, Katie Button, have taken over reading the SETs that Jim had installed all across the Northeast in between Virginia through Maine. And so I have been working on helping Jim to somewhat organize and QA/QC over 20 years of data. And this is 155 sets across 9 parks that he has been measuring mostly by himself for a lot of that time. I'm in the process of making an R package that we will use for data transformation, analysis, and plotting. And I'm also hoping to produce some data science, communication, visualization products so that we can get these data into the hands of our park resource managers. So I just wanted to give a little background on what the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program is, because I imagine we're maybe not as well known as I wish we were. So just putting it plainly, the overall goal of the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program is to provide the science that gets used for park management. So the natural resources inventories help us to understand the range of natural resources in and around parks. So they help us understand what things we have in the parks, right? And then the long-term monitoring component helps us understand how these resources might be changing over time. And this includes things like detecting change, identifying any potential problems in the early stages, and measuring successes. So in addition to SETs, what we monitor with the Northeast Coastal and Barrier I&M program, we do wetland vegetation, wetland nekton, 2 different types of coastal geomorphology. With estuaries, we monitor seagrass and water quality. And we also do upland forests and some weather and climate. And we monitor these things at these 8 different parks. I'm not going to list them out, but you can see them there across the coastal Northeast. And I also want to point out that there are several other NPS I&M networks that also use sets. So those include the Northeast Temperate Network, of course, the Northeast Coastal and Barrier, the National Capital Region Network, the Southeast Coast Network, and the South Florida and Caribbean Network. And this little map shows all of the sites that the NPS has SETs along the East Coast. And I'll just note that I gave the link to that data set is publicly available on our data store if you're ever interested in getting into that. So before I get to the next part of my talk, I just want to warn you about the incoming wall of text that I have on some of these slides. Normally, I believe in keeping text on your slides to a minimum, but I wanted this presentation to be something that you can refer back to as needed. And for me, I've also found that having things written out can be really important for accessibility. Some people do better with reading rather than listening. And then having everything written out here will be, I'm sure, nice for people who are interested in this info but who couldn't be here live. And so this slide is kind of just a reminder. If you come back to this presentation later, make sure you check the notes field, since that's where I'm going to be putting a lot of the details that I go over for each slide. And I'm also going to be posting them to my GitHub, which I have linked there. All right. So let me first define what I call the SET data lifecycle. So the lifecycle includes several steps, such as designing the study, installing your sets, collecting data, entering the data, analyzing the data, and finally publishing the results. So all of these steps seem relatively straightforward, and maybe with the exception of step number 2, installing the sets, this is the same empirical research model that we all learned in school, right? But the set data lifecycle is a little bit different because we're incorporating monitoring into the workflow. So we usually have repetition between steps 3 through 7. So you don't just collect set data one time and then publish it, right? You're making repeated trips to the field, entering data, cleaning data, analyzing, and probably publishing in some respect over and over again. And it's because of this repetition that we need to be a little bit more methodical with some of these steps. So I'll briefly go over the distinction between research and monitoring, and on the next slide, I'll talk about why this distinction matters. In general, research is designed for addressing specific questions or hypotheses. There are generally unknown future paths, like will you expand on this research or go in a different direction? The methods that are used for this research are going to be customized specifically for the questions that you're trying to answer, and this research is expected to expand the bounds of our existing knowledge. And usually the most common product for research is peer-reviewed literature, sometimes also reports. And a good example of this would be the LTER program and the experiments that get done as part of that. Monitoring, however, is designed to document current conditions and address changes over time. Usually there's a well-defined future path. We keep monitoring, right? Monitoring requires some standardized methods so that our results can be comparable both over time and maybe also to other monitoring efforts. And so monitoring results can sometimes be published as literature, but they're very often published as some sort of gray literature or some other sort of report. And some examples that I know of include, of course, the NPS INM program and the NEON program. So we do have a lot of overlap between the two types, but the SET lifecycle includes elements of both. And I want to just stress that neither one is better than the other, right? Both are very good and important. So traditionally, we've had academic institutions that have really been focused on teaching research side, and really that's good because those skills like empiricism and critical thinking that you learn there are really important for the research life cycle and also important for the monitoring life cycle. So while many of those attitudes are changing now, we had typically viewed monitoring in the past, I think, as something that was more of a management activity that was maybe unrelated to true scientific research. Also, on a personal level, I think many of us might not have necessarily been super excited about doing monitoring work, because when we think about our science careers, we want to do the fun stuff, right? Not something like sitting in front of a computer. We want to be designing new studies. We want to be out in the field. We also like pushing the science forward, doing new things, not necessarily doing the same things on repeat, which is really kind of a necessary part of monitoring. Additionally, even when we were super excited for monitoring, we spent a lot of time doing other things, getting money, teaching, supervising, right? So we might have limited time for other things that we might see as non-urgent tasks. Additionally, on the institutional level, research studies have typically been favored due to lower costs, fewer long-term staffing and money commitments, and also just general incentives within the career field for getting more grants, rapid output of novel findings. And so that's one of the reasons why maybe some of these skills that are more associated with monitoring hadn't been such of a big focus until recently. So as a result of all these reasons that I just stated, we usually receive little training as students and spend little time in our careers as researchers developing experience in these monitoring skills and processes. So I'm talking about things like data management, fidelity, documentation, and publication, statistical methods that are specific to quote unquote living data or data that's being continuously updated, things like reproducible research, and maybe effectively communicating results to stakeholders, resources managers, or non-technical audiences. So going back to the set life cycle, I'm going to dive deeper into each one of these steps just briefly. So first off, steps 1 through 3, we know those are well defined by multiple different prior set publications like the Cahoon papers from 2002, the NPS set protocol from Jim Lynch, Philippe Hensel, and Don Cahoon. And the standardization that we have in these steps is really what is such a huge strength of the SET method, right? We can install SETs anywhere in the world and know that that data will be directly comparable to both other SET data and to rates of sea level rise. So I'm going to focus a little bit more in this presentation on steps 4 through 7 because this is where things can get a little bit wonky. So steps 4 and 5 include entering and storing data, data management, cleaning data, transforming data in preparation for analysis. And what I've noticed here is that most groups develop their own standalone procedures, and they may or may not publish their data and their metadata. In step 6, we have, step 6, we have analysis and visualization. So generally, we use linear regression for our analysis, and we provide some standardized plots that you're used to seeing. We have lots of different software options for doing that, and as a result of that, we have lots of different ways of doing this analysis. Linear regression is a standard, like I said, but there are lots of sort of details in how we implement and estimate our rates from that analysis. And then for step 7, publishing, we're pretty used to publishing, our peer-reviewed papers, conference presentations, and occasionally we might do reports. And more rarely, we're not as used to doing things like web-based reports or interactive visualizations, even though those are becoming more common and something that more of our audience wants to see. So now I'm going to go over just briefly some of the issues that I see frequently in dealing with SET data, and then I'm going to talk about some potential solutions and resources. And I'll note that my goal in pointing these things out is I'm not trying to shame anyone. I am just as guilty of many of these things. I'm just trying to share what I've learned during my years of working with set data so that hopefully you can avoid some of the same pitfalls. And I'll also mention that I don't expect anyone to be an expert in any of these topics. That's not necessary, and that's not my goal here either. I just want you to be at least familiar with them and keep them in the back of your mind. So, of course, many of these issues are not just limited to set studies, but can also be present in other monitoring or even research projects. So, in addition to, lack of experience and emphasis on some of these topics, the first issue I often see is what we call in the programming world, not invented here syndrome, okay? So this is a form of cognitive bias where people favor solutions that they created themselves or that originated within their own group, even if better options exist elsewhere. And I'm not saying you can't do things the way you want to, but I always think that it's good to see how others have solved a problem, and then maybe you won't need to spend as much time working out a totally original solution, or you can adapt that solution to work for your data. Another issue that I see is even if, let's say, we go out and we want to see how other people have dealt with their SET data, the tools and processes that a lot of other groups have developed are either not widely shared, if they're shared at all, or they're not easily discoverable with like basic search tools. So even though we usually publish the steps taken for, our data collection and analysis in the methods section of our papers, we don't necessarily provide enough step-by-step detail or other information about our processes for data management and QA/QC that somebody might need to directly reproduce what we do. Additionally, even if other tools are available, we might just not know or understand how to adapt and integrate these tools in our workflow. And finally, we see frequent personnel changes that are common. I don't know if I want to call that an issue, but a common thing that happen in our research groups. And this can impact long-term monitoring projects because everybody likes to do things a little bit differently. And so that's why it's important to have good documentation and clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So why should you care about any of this? You've been publishing set data and everything's going fine, right? So why should you care? The issues here is that these things can either jeopardize productivity or the long-term sustainability of your SAT program. So for instance, there can be significant impacts to productivity. You end up wasting time and effort trying to find files or determine which data file is the correct one to use for analysis. Or you can waste time and effort organizing or cleaning data that hasn't been well maintained. And of course, that leaves you less time for all of the fun things that you really want to be doing, going out in the field, doing data analysis, writing publications, whatever. Additionally, these issues can have some significant impacts to the long-term sustainability of your SET program. So things like losing or forgetting important information, things like which set of pins goes with which instrument. Do we need to use the longer set of pins now, the old set of pins? Things like that. And this can result in the introduction of errors or loss of data. And it can also introduce issues with being unable to replicate the steps that you used for QA/QC and analysis, which in turn would make it difficult for you to update your results when you get new data. So I'll just briefly go over this graphic, which is from Mishner et al. In 1997, and it demonstrates how lost knowledge about a data product can happen over time. And so the research team publishes a paper, and then over time, specific details get lost as those people move on to other things. Then over time, we might have general details getting lost, and ultimately having people move on, and we might have some accidents or unintentional destruction of data. And so this graphic, I'm not going to go over in too much detail, but this is really just to show that this is something that people have been thinking about for a long time. And so I think it's just something that we all need to be cognizant of. So now I'm going to transition to talking about some of my suggestions for fortifying the SAT data lifecycle. And then I'll go over some specific resources that I found that I think would be helpful to you. I'll note that the things on this slide really apply to all of the stages of the SAT lifecycle. So first and foremost, I think it's really, really, really important to check in and communicate frequently with other people on your team or even your stakeholders to identify things that are or aren't working and come to a consensus on how you want to move forward with them and just make sure that everybody is on the same page. So as an example, within the NPS I&M networks, we have a formalized process for doing this that we call yearly operational reviews. And we do this for every single one of the protocols that we monitor, and we do it annually. And another thing about this is that we both document the things that we go over in these meetings and we publish our notes so that everybody can refer back to them and we all make sure that we're on the same page. I've also found that it's really important, like I said previously, to define your roles and responsibilities within your group. And this can be a collaborative process. Everybody can go around and kind of say what they feel comfortable doing or what they might need help with. You don't have to dictate this out to everybody, right? But I think it's important to make sure that everybody knows what things they're supposed to be doing, because if you don't put those things up front, then that's when things can start to get overlooked. So I would also then urge you to consider some of the potential downstream effects of both your current workflow and any of the changes that you might consider making. So potential downstream effects could be, okay, say you make this change about the format of your raw data now. Is that change going to make it more difficult for your team to work with the data because of some other software that's not compatible with that format? So it's things like that that I consider the downstream effects that you should think carefully about. Of course, all of this is to say, if you're happy with your current system, you can ignore all of this and keep it the way you want. I'm not going to try to convince you that you need to change anything. I would also just stress you don't need to fix something that isn't broken. All of the things that I'm going to point out are just some ideas for you to think over and stuff that has worked well for me in the past. And in fact, I would caution that drastic changes are likely unnecessary and they can hurt, right? You're probably already doing a lot of things already. If you really feel like you want to do something to improve your current processes, I would focus on the simple things of like making sure you have good documentation of all of your processes, organizing your files, developing a standardized field data sheet, things like that, right? Then if you're more interested and you want to get more advanced, you can pick up things like databases, packaging your code, or developing some automated reporting. And again, I'll just stress that you really want to make sure you get buy-in from your team on all these things. And that is because people are unlikely to use things that they don't understand or that don't work for them. So maybe you wrote a really nice R script, but nobody on your team knows how to use it. They're probably not going to use it if they don't know how, they don't have the time to use it, they're intimidated by it, etc. Okay. So another one of my main recommendations is to document everything. We really need to get things out of our brain and on paper because everyone forgets, me especially. So write out your SOPs, be specific and include pictures. And when you do this, pretend you have a new person joining the project who has never before in their life seen or heard of an SET and lay out the steps needed to follow your procedures. And when you do this, you don't need to, rewrite the NPS SOP. You can point to that and say, these are the procedures that we use for X, Y, and Z. And I also think it's really helpful to think about what you should document in terms of what would somebody need to continue doing something if you were to leave, right? And so this could be things like protocol deviations, like SET3 at Acetique needs to use the longer pins, and that started in 2016. And so you'll need to adjust the data from before that time to account for pin links whenever you reanalyze that data. But this really also includes things that are like logistical, like where do you launch the boat from to access this site? Or don't try to go to this site during high tide because it'll be underwater. So stuff like that is also really important to document. And so in this table, I just listed out a bunch of different things that you should think about documenting. And so those are just a few suggestions about documentation for you. Now I'm going to move on to some of my recommendations for data entry and storage, those steps of the life cycle. So a big one for me is establish some standardized file naming and folder structures. And not only do that, but make sure you document them. And so this is really important because it'll make it much easier to keep all of your relevant data files organized, and it'll help to prevent confusion and error resulting from not knowing which data files should be used for what. And so don't forget to, document your file naming conventions, and within that documentation, it could even be helpful to provide examples of what things you should name each file and where those specific kind of files should go. Another big one is to create a template of your field data sheet and stick to it. So make a blank one in Excel or Word or wherever you want to make it, stick that in its own folder, and then try to reuse that and make, as minimal modifications to it as possible. Spreadsheets are great for data entry and storage. Anybody who says you need to have a database, you don't need to have a database, okay? Spreadsheets are perfectly fine. The only thing about spreadsheets is that you need to be careful with certain things when you're using them for data entry for monitoring data. And a lot of us just don't have the experience for databases, so they're not, necessarily a valid solution for all of us. Spreadsheets are more practical. You need to make sure that you keep your raw data as clean as you can and keep it separate from other things. And for me, I've found that that's really important. So you don't want to mix, don't transform data in the same spreadsheet as your raw data file. Don't do QA/QC or analysis on the same spreadsheet as your raw data. For me, what I like to do is use what's called versioning in the software world. So this would be, you create a copy of your raw data spreadsheet, and then you can do whatever kind of transformations and analysis you want to do in there, and you save the copy of the raw data sheet. And the same thing for when you're adding new data, save a copy and then update the copy of the new data sheet with your additional raw data. And usually what I'll do, or what I've done in the past, is just put the date that you have on that when you entered the new data, and then put everything else in like a folder that you call old or archive, something like that. And another thing that's really helpful if you're going to use spreadsheets for your data entry and storage, Excel has tools that you can use to control for data entry errors, alterations, or deletions. That's normally something that we think of when we think about databases, and that's why databases are good, but we can do most of those things in Excel and spreadsheets as well. And so a good check for yourself when you're thinking about your data entry and storage is that you want to think about, is your data, does it abide by FAIR data principles? So that would be, is it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? And this acronym FAIR data is something that we talk about a lot in the data management world. That's just a check for you, for something to think about. If that resonates with you, use it. If it doesn't, ignore it. Okay, so now I'm going to do a few recommendations for doing stuff with your SET data. So stuff like cleaning, transformation, analysis, and visualization. I personally prefer to use programming tools whenever possible, because I think they really make it a lot easier both to document your processes and to reuse them later. So I have code that I use for QA/QC, data processing and transformation, analysis, visualizations, reporting, metadata creation, and publication. Of course, I understand that a lot of other people prefer to use Excel or your other point-and-click software. So point-and-click would be things like SAS or JMP. I'm not going to try to convince you to not use them, because I think it's important that you do what works for you. But when you use these tools, I think you need to take some extra precautions to make sure that your steps are repeatable. So for example, if you use Excel for these tasks, I would recommend that you create a blank template workbook that has some built-in controls and formulas that can be reused every time you do these data processing and analysis steps. And I'll also note that Excel also has tools for scripting and automation if you want to try it within that environment. When you document all these processes, because of course you're going to document them, right? Make sure that your documentation also includes the why for each of the important steps that you take, or for things that might not be obvious. So for example, don't just do a comment that says add 1,000 to each pin measurement, but say add 1,000 to each pin measurement for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? Another tip is for both your code and other programs, try to keep it clean and human readable. So this means it should be written in a way that's easily understood by other humans rather than being optimized for machine execution. And my personal favorite tool for accomplishing this is the tidyverse set of packages in R. Another tip, when you find yourself repeating a task, and that can be either in code or in your point and click software, that's a good sign that you should try to save that function in some way so that it can be reused. You want to try to limit your reliance on copy and pasting things, because that is an easy way to introduce errors. Another tip, package and share your code or your worksheet templates and include examples for how to use them. And this is important not only for repeatability, but hopefully as a group, if we all start doing this more, we can limit having to reinvent the wheel. And one final tip on this point is that you'll want to document your entire workflow. So that includes the data processing through analysis and publication steps. And that's because throughout all these steps, you're likely going to be using a number of different tools for different parts of this process. So it's important to show the entire tool chain of how all of these things are meant to work together. All right. So now I'm going to go over a bunch of different resources for fortifying the SET data lifecycle. And some of these are going to include some set specific resources, and I'm also going to include some general resources for things like documentation, file naming and folder structures, data entry and QA/QC, data analysis and visualization, and reporting. So first on this slide, here are some resources that were developed specifically for the NPS inventory and monitoring set program, but I think that these could also be useful to other groups. So this first resource obviously has to be the OG, the NPS SETMH protocol, and this was first developed in 2015 by Jim Lynch, Philippe Hensel, and Don Cahoon. And so this one it was kind of a foundational text, because even though we've been using SET since the early 90s, I think this was really the first document to describe in step-by-step detail all the things you need to do for designing your set studies, installing them, and collecting data. And I'll note that this protocol also contains some general SOPs for data management and analysis. And I'll note that the link for this SETMH protocol, if you go there, there's also a sample field data sheet and a sample spreadsheet for data entry and QA/QC if you're looking for something like that. And version 2 of the protocol is coming soon. Hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have it published live. And so version 2 is going to be updating and adding to a lot of the detail that we had in the first version, but it's also going to include some new information. So for things about updating SET benchmarks if you need to raise them up, replacing marker horizons, installing water level loggers, and some additional details about data management and analysis. So this next bullet point, these are the protocol implementations for the Southeast Coast Network and the South Florida and Caribbean Network SET programs. And within the NPS INM program, we use protocol implementation plans, PIPs is what they call them, to document any of our sort of like network specific SET information. So that could be things like logistical information like schedules, site maps, directions for accessing the site. And also included in these are some stuff that I think are, good ideas for people to document. So like obviously the things that are in these protocol implementation plans are not going to be, necessarily relevant for you all, but I think they're just really good examples of a good way to document those kind of things. So the next two resources that I have linked here are our INM specific SOPs for SET data entry, QA, QC, and data publication. Again, the details here of those are not going to necessarily be relevant to you, but I think they're another good example that you could look at if you go to develop your own version of these. And then the final resource shows code that we use for creating the metadata and the process that we use for publishing our SET data when we create our data packages every year. Again, that's just a nice example for you to look at if you're interested in doing something like that. So the next few resources that I have are SET specific tools that are for use with R code. I know I focus on R because that's my preferred language. I'm sure there are others that people have done in Python, but I like to focus on R. So first is the set R package that was developed by Kim Cressman for the NARES program. And this package has some really, really great functions for creating visualizations that can be used to both QA, QC data and to calculate and visualize cumulative surface elevation change and accretion. One thing to note about this package is that in order to use the functions within it, you'll need to reformat your data to match the NERS format, but that should be relatively easy and mostly just a matter of changing some column names and maybe pivoting your data from wide to long format. But Kim has included an example data set within the package so that you can see what your data needs to look like in order to work with the package. Then there's also the set R reserve template, also developed by Kim Cressman for the NERS. And I included this as a good resource because this is a really good way to show or document the steps needed to complete the entire SET data lifecycle. So this includes the code and instruction for the full NERS workflow, including the steps for data entry, processing, analysis, visualization, and report creation. Next are two SET specific resources that were built for the NPS INM program, but similar to the NERS set R package, I think that you could adapt these to work with your data. You just need to reformat your data. I've included examples of the data that we use so that you can see how you would need to reformat your data to work with it. And so for our package, I wanted to, standardize and document some NPS specific functions that we do. I'll note that I heavily borrowed and adapted from Kim's set R package. So some of it is a little bit repetitive and there's maybe a little bit of reinventing the wheel there, but I felt that it was important to have our own version of that package. Number one, because I wanted to use these functions as a way to document our processes, and also because I wanted to limit the amount of sort of data transformation that folks would have to do, because I know I have some people in my NPS SET group that are not super well versed in R, and I wanted to limit the amount of data transformation that they would have to do to use it. I also included some functions for steps that are important for us, like calculating and visualizing linear rates of change and downloading NOAA data and getting long-term or recent rates of sea level rise from the nearest NOAA station. Another resource is our SET Viz package, and this was developed by Ellen Chang, that's specifically for our NPS set data. And this is really nice because Ellen made this really fancy dashboard style interactive visual that we use for QA QCing our data. Again, this is meant specifically for our data format, but I've included it here in case you wanted to try to use it with your own data or develop your own version. and there are instructions for it in this NPS SOP that I've linked to here. So the next 3 slides, I'm not going to go over them in depth. I have a ton more resources linked here that I thought might be interesting to you all or relevant to you all. And so these are a few papers or other resources. Some of them are SET specific, some of them are data specific, but I'm just going to leave them here for you in case you want to go back to those later. Okay, so finally, I'm going to discuss some strategies and examples for integrating our SET data into natural resources management. And continuing on with the theme of the SET data lifecycle, I would consider this an essential part of the final publish step. So first, I'm going to be talking about some of these strategies in the context of journal publications, and then I'll discuss a few other types of products. So one strategy that I've noticed in a few different papers is to use your SET data to identify the most at-risk areas that would benefit from either conservation or restoration. So this example comes from Delgado et al. 2024, and they measured SETs in different marsh zones and used the rates of surface elevation change that they got there to suggest which areas should be prioritized for restoration. So they found that these primary channels lost elevation at a rate of negative 11 millimeters per year. And so using that data, they recommend if restoration is to be considered, it should focus on the vulnerable low marsh zones, right? So I really like this example because it's using data to identify an area at risk and then suggesting that that area should be prioritized. Another strategy is to use your SET data to identify some either successful or unsuccessful management actions and also quantify the degree of impact. So in this example from Feher et al. 2024, they used SETs to measure surface elevation change in marshes that were created from fine-grained, nutrient-rich dredge material from the upper Chesapeake Bay. And so this is referring to the restoration project at Poplar Island in Maryland. And here they found the mean low marsh rate of elevation change exceeded both the reference marsh and relative sea level rise. And then based on their findings, they suggest that the use of fine-grained dredge sediment as a substrate for tidal marsh restoration basically is a valid strategy and that this could be applied to other future products. So another example of this strategy, and this comes from North Carolina's coastal wetlands. This is from the white paper that they put out. So they found that marshes with living sill shorelines had positive rates of surface elevation change as compared to the reference marshes. And so based on their data there, they suggest that these living sill shorelines can be an effective restoration strategy. So it's, number one, identifying either successful or unsuccessful management actions and quantifying the degree of impact. Another strategy that I've seen is to use your data to provide somewhat of a generalized framework that could be used for decision making, and then also provide some examples of how that framework can be used. So these 2 papers from Ganju et al. 2024 combined SET data with UVVR data, so unvegetated to vegetated ratio, to develop this decision support metrics for use with the RAD framework. And they also give some examples of how they might use this framework as well. So one final strategy that I'll go over is to use your SET data to both evaluate the current state of the ecosystem and identify any specific deficits or needs for action. And so here in this paper, Hartig et al. Utilized SET data in conjunction with a couple of other metrics to create an index for assessing salt marsh condition in the area around New York. And this example is also really nice because not only do they detail how they developed this index, they talk a little bit about how they used it to inform restoration projects around the city. So next I'm going to go over a few examples of ways to effectively communicate your results so that your SET data can be integrated into resource management. Although I know we're all really familiar with publishing papers, I think it can be important to take a little bit of a different approach when you're trying to engage with stakeholders, resource managers, or our decision makers, right? A few general tips. Ask your audience what type of content would be helpful to them. You might have your preferred method, they might want something else, right? Don't overcomplicate your methods, your results, or discussion. If you want to give them more detail, you can point to your paper, right? Focus on a small number of take-home messages, and then use mostly visuals to illustrate your main points. And finally, if possible, use your results to provide recommendations. I'll note that very often, for example, in the federal government, we're really not allowed to be overly prescriptive. You can make general recommendations. If you can make specific recommendations, I'm sure that's even better. And so here, if you want to see just an example of what I'm talking about, I left one at the bottom there for you to read over later. So next I'm going to show you a few examples of these kind of data communication products that I think could be really helpful for getting resource managers and decision makers to engage with your data. And the more they engage with your data, the more likely your data is to get incorporated into some sort of natural resource management action, right? So this first example comes from the New Jersey DEP, and this is their online map of SET stations that they have throughout the state. And a lot of groups have created these monitoring maps, and I love these. These are awesome because they make it really obvious if there are any spatial trends, and they make it really obvious and easier to focus on where there might be any hotspots. This is another example. This one is from the USGS group at Woods Hole. This one is also nice because they incorporate a bunch of other data layers that might be of interest to people who are working with SET data. So things like vegetative cover, UVVR. Of course, I have to mention you all's map, and this is amazing. Great job with this app. I really love the way that you've incorporated the option to have all of those different layers. I think this is going to be super helpful, not only for resource managers, but for also other researchers as well. And so this next example comes from a publication that I did with Gina Moon at Fish and Wildlife Service. And I feel like this one is particularly useful because it's giving you a lot of information on like those main take-home points in a single figure. And I've seen this kind of figure being reused frequently. And so this figure shows your rates of surface elevation change at each site within the different refuges, and it's highlighted by that red dot, right? And so from this, you're able to compare your rate of surface elevation change to both your recent sea level rise, that's that gray polygon in the background, and then you can also compare to some future predicted rates of sea level rise that I put in those colored polygons there. And so I like this graphic. I think this is a nice, simple one that can be really good to use for communicating these kind of take-home messages. This is another map, but this one is a static graphic, and this was actually produced by Kim Cressman at the NERS. And this was from their national SET synthesis. And I like this one because it's showing data from, a huge spatial area, lots of different SETs in lots of different areas, but it makes it really easy to compare how rates of surface elevation change vary throughout the US. And this is another example from the NERS. So this is, this graphic on the left is really nice. It's what I call, or I think Kim came up with the name of this TIE fighter style plot because it shows you a lot of different information all in one plot again. So you not only have your rates of surface elevation change at the different stations, it gives you your uncertainty around those rates, it gives you your recent rate of sea level rise. So you can not only see how the different sites compare to each other, but also to sea level rise. And this is again another version of the map graphic where she used different colored and direction arrows to show the SET trends at different stations. And finally, this graphic is from a report that was produced and published online by the National Capital Region INM network. And this uses, again, that similar TIE fighter style graph. And they also have, this is a really good example of a good way of keeping the text brief and to the point. So in this text here, they also included a little bit of context about the trends that they're seeing. Okay, and so, of course, another important part of the publication step is acknowledging all of the people that you've worked with. So I just need to shout out these few people: Jim Lynch, Sarah Stevens, Katie Button, Ches Vervacki, Mike Oslin, Gordon Anderson, Andre Daniels, Tom Smith, and Gina Moon. And a couple of links here, my GitHub, Google Scholar, and the NPS Coastal and Barrier Inventory and Monitoring website. And you'll notice that all throughout the presentation, there are tons of links because, like I said, I want you all to be able to go back to this. And so I can take questions if we have any time.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was exceptional. If you don't mind emailing me your presentation,
Yes.
and then I can post it on the Sakura website and email out to the community of practice, only because we can't click on your links, but they're super valuable. So
Sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? And Chess is here. 3 cheers for Chess. You are a guru. Questions? We have time for questions.
Chess literally taught me how to read SETs. So
Yeah, well, you're doing the data side. I'm the field side. I take care of the field side, but you are the data guru.
Yay. No questions. I told you everything you need to know then. Great. I expect to see all of your R packages published within the next year.
I'll add to, I keep emailing one person, but I put on the chat. We have on our Sakura SET site a resource hub, and we have protocols. So Laura, we can add, if you're comfortable, all your R scripts and other protocols to what we have been pulling together.
Yeah, certainly.
Today.
All of that stuff is publicly available. So
great.
If anyone finds it useful, I anticipated that I would ever be the only one using it and that nobody would ever find it useful. So if one person gets something out of it,
no, we'll use it.
That's good for me.
In fact, Riley has made himself available to work up data using the Kim Cressman's R. So we look forward to playing with your script as well. Any questions?
I have a quick one, if I might. And I'm not sure if it's for Laura or the larger community. I'm used to working with simpler data sets that have community established methods, QA/QC protocols. We're federally authorized, so we don't publish data that's not properly curated. How far is the community from a universal data collection standard? Because it seems like that was a lot of what you were addressing and encouraging, Laura. And I'm new to this, so is there a lot of negotiation? Will it be easy? Are we 90% there? And anyway, any perspective on that would be welcome.
Has a lot to say about this, I can tell.
Yes, I do. So Dr. Goldberg, you remember when you first started this, I told you that you had a tough row to hoe. Just because, what you're talking about has been tried many, many, many times, and nobody up to this point has gotten it right yet. And, I don't know why. I don't know if it's just too many chefs in the kitchen or what. Laura knows this, Dr. Goldberg knows this, but I've constantly bragged on the near, all the nears, because they're the ones that I have seen come closest to actually achieving that goal. Um, you know, uh, Other than that, I don't know why it constantly fails. Louisiana's tried it. Their data is tough to get to. NPS is in the process of trying to get it to where it's more accessible. Laura's got a big hand in that. Right now, the data is completely accessible, and anybody can do whatever they want to with our data. But we haven't. We haven't analyzed anything in that to share to a bigger community. But I've never seen really anybody be successful at bringing all of these groups together. It's been tried many, many, many times. I'm sure there are multiple people on this call that know how much it's been tried and know how many times it's failed. But like I said, the nears come closest to that I've seen.
And that's a good segue into Will and Katie's session on data metadata. So maybe we can crack that nut just for the Sakura SET. Yeah, I hope we can do that miracle. So,
I know people I think the issue is that people really like to use their own thing. And that's not necessarily because they want to be stubborn and hard headed. It's because that's what works for them and that's easiest, right? So for me, I think data standardization is good, but we also have people that are, like myself, that can deal with data that's not standardized. So it being not standardized is in a lot of ways a huge hurdle, but it's not insurmountable, right? Like a lot of the projects I've done have been collecting data from multiple different people that use different formats. And because the SET is collecting all the same type of data, at least, it's, in my mind, not insurmountable to be able to collate that data all together if you're interested in doing some sort of synthesis. But it would be a lot easier if we could standardize it in some way.
we have another question from George. Is there a developing international set community?
I don't know if there's anything formalized,
Yeah,
but there are tons of people in Australia that do sets. They're used all over the world. Um, I don't know, maybe every continent except Antarctica. So
for now.
for now, yeah, great.
Um, Okay, I think and a round of applause, Laura. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
And we will regroup after our lunch break. Thank you.